Hello and welcome to your very first video in biology. So this is what I mean by a flipped classroom, and with my particular slides, you'll notice that I pause after every slide and give you an opportunity to answer the questions in Edpuzzle. These videos are meant for you to get the information. They're not meant for you to memorize all the information before coming to class. It's for you to become familiar with the information so when you come to class, we can have a conversation on this information. So again, I do not expect you to be an expert at any of this. I just want to introduce the information to you before you come to class the next day, so that way we can have a little bit more of a conversation that's not super structured and more just able to, for you to relate to the information in the real world. Every single time, I always start with an introduction slide, just talking about what we get into, and then I will go into an objective slide. So in this, or at the end of this video, the things that you should be able to do is define biology, list the characteristics of living things and give examples of each, understand the 4 core principles of biology, define biodiversity, and apply the concepts of changes in organisms to biodiversity. So I understand that maybe you don't know what these things mean now, but when you compare this video to the notes that you also have to write in your notebook, hopefully there's some connection there. So the first thing I want to do with you is define what biology means. In class, we talked that the prefix bio means life, and then the suffix -logy or ology means living. Or excuse me, not living, it means the study of. So if we put those two together, it means the study of life. And when we talk about living things, the correct term we use is organisms. So at the beginning, I'll say living things to just kind of rope you into getting used to it. But when we talk about anything that's considered living, it is called an organism. We try to stay away from the word thing in science because it really doesn't give you a full concrete definition of what something is. So again, organism indicates a living thing. In order to be considered living, an organism must have the following characteristics. So you'll notice here I have this nice little graphic. In your notes, I've provided a little bit of a definition and an example of what all of these look like, and we'll talk about them in this video. So the first characteristic, or excuse me, the qualities of living things must have the following. So in order to be considered living, you have to have all of the characteristics of living things. If something has one characteristic of a living thing but doesn't have anything else, it cannot be a living thing. It has to have all of the characteristics of living things in order to be considered an organism. The first one I want to talk about is response to the environment. And that's this one here. Anytime something or an organism responds to the environment, this means they make the conscious decision to somehow respond to that. Some organisms do not respond as fast as others. For example, if a rock is being thrown at me, I can respond pretty quickly to move out of the way so I don't get hit. But that may not be the case for something that's like super small, like a little amoeba that lives in water. So maybe my hand is coming and I swipe the amoeba out of the way. It doesn't have a chance to respond because it doesn't move as fast. And that's based on evolutionary changes to help with survival, which we'll get to a little bit in this video, but we'll also get to when we talk about this towards maybe December timeframe. But I want you to understand every organism has the capability to respond to the environment in some way. Maybe not the same as humans, but in some way, every organism responds to its environment. Excuse me. The second fact is to grow and develop. For humans, this looks like it's a very obvious thing where you go from being a baby into a toddler, into a child, into a teenager, and then into an adult, and eventually growing old. That's a pretty obvious grow and developed change. However, every single organism grows and develops in some way. You always start as an organism that is brand new, and then eventually you grow and develop. And develop can mean so many things. It doesn't necessarily mean a full-on identity change. It could mean that you develop and understand how to do a concept better. For example, an amoeba, while it's very simple living organism, it doesn't develop a whole lot, but it has the capability to learn, okay, there's no food source here. I'm going to go and find a different food source. So understand, develop doesn't necessarily always mean a full concrete physical change. A development can be deemed as something like, I learned this today, I didn't know it yesterday. So keep that in mind. The third characteristic is to produce offspring, or what's known as reproducing. The reason why organisms do this is to ensure that their species survives. And the reason for reproducing is to ensure a species survives. When a species survives, they are able to pass on genetic information. And that is the definition of a successful species. When you can pass on genetic information that ensures your species survives, that is the definition of a successful species. So reproducing, very important to, again, creating more species for that particular organism. Producing offspring, passing on genetic material. The fourth characteristic is known as homeostasis, obtain and use energy in some way. So I didn't put that official word here for homeostasis. I just put energy, obtain and use energy. I actually used this from this fun little site here. But I want you to understand, and this is a key word, so we will probably highlight this in our notes, and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail. Homeostasis is the idea where we keep things constant. If you are in gym and your heart rate starts to beat really, really fast because you're exercising or doing something to make your heart rate increase, your body responds to that because it's not normal, it's not equal or balanced to have your heart rate go that fast. So what happens is your body is responding by cooling you down. You start to sweat, and that sweat is what's going to help bring your body back down, your body temperature back down, which thus starts to decrease your heart rate, bringing it back down to a normal level. It's okay to be out of homeostasis for a little bit, but your body should be responding to bring you back to homeostasis. So your body has to have a way to regulate and keep you constant. Every living organism maintains homeostasis in some way. For complex organisms such as mammals, us, we have a very complex way of making sure we maintain homeostasis. For other organisms, very simplistic organisms, they have a much easier way to balance and keep energy at a more constant level. But the point I'm trying to make here is that every living organism has the ability to be balanced. Number 5, complex chemistry. And so that is here defined as different levels of organization, or this idea that we are all made up of some kind of complex way to obtain energy, not just to obtain energy, but to keep our organizational levels there to help us develop. This is all based on chemistry. Next year, if you take chemistry with me, we'll learn about those atoms and elements. And hopefully those words sound familiar from last year. But what that means is that you are using various atoms, elements, and molecules to keep your body running. So an example would be like a plant using water and carbon dioxide to undergo photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the process of making food for a plant, also known as energy or glucose. And that concept is very important because that's a very, very complex ordeal. And we'll talk about that in class and what that whole ordeal looks like. It is very much more complex than just absorbing sun and pushing out food. There's a lot more that goes on into it. But the point I'm trying to make here is that every organism has the ability to utilize non-living things such as atoms and elements to create a way of living in a way that ensures that they survive. One thing you'll notice in the notes is that I don't have a number 6 after my number 5. I'm not sure what happened there. You are going to be adding, my watch just went off. How embarrassing. Okay, you're going to add in a number 6 in your notes, and it's going to say made up of cells. And so that's this last concept here. Made up of cells, meaning that any living organism has to be made up of a type of cell, whether that be more of like a plant-like cell or an human-like cell. That is a conversation we'll have later, but every living organism has to have cells. That is one of the biggest differences. If you see something that maybe you think is living, but it doesn't have cells, that's the first indicator that is not living. And this is what actually rules out viruses for being considered living, is because they're not made up of cells. So the huge debate is, are they actually living or not? Because they do some of these things, but they're not made up of cells. And if these are the principles, if these are the characteristics that unify all living things, then a virus cannot be considered living if it's not made up of cells. Again, I know that I talk very fast, so please, in class, stop me if you don't understand something. But this is a list that I really want you to keep in mind as we go through every single unit in this class for the entire year. The next slide, the principles that unify biology. There are 4 core concepts that we will basically be spending the entire year on. And it's kind of weird because if you really look at our entire curriculum, all of my concepts are centered around these 4 core ideas. So the first one being the cell theory. We just talked about how living organisms have to be made up of cells. Whether that cell is complex or not complex is a different question, but it has to be made up of some kind of cell. The cell is a basic unit of structure and function for all living things, meaning every single complex chemistry that a living thing goes through is done inside of a cell. All living organisms have cells. I cannot stress that enough. All living organisms have cells. In order to be considered living, you have a cell or cells. So that is the first principle. Every single biologist knows this. If it's living, has cells in some way. The second unifying principle is the gene theory, which is right here. I kind of mixed up my pictures. The gene theory stating that living qualities of an organism are controlled by what's known as genes. Genes are little pockets of information that are established in our DNA. And if you don't already know this, DNA is what is the inheritable traits that are passed down from your parents. So you are a combination of both your mother and your father, and those genes come together to form you. You are a unique individual because of the complex combination of the genes from your mother and from your father. And again, we'll talk about this a lot when we get into genetics, but understand, in order for a living organism to pass on genetic information, there has to be a combination of DNA. Those genes go on to make you who you are. So you'll see here inside of every single cell, we hold what's called a nucleus, and that has what's called chromosomes. Chromosomes contain DNA, and on that DNA, there are different genes. Different genes tell what kind of characteristics you'll have. And this is why there's so much variety when it comes to what people look like, because of the genes that people inherit, and how that inheritance looks for every individual person really does make a difference with people's looks, with people's personalities. All of those qualities dictate what a person will be like. So the gene theory. The third principle is homeostasis. So we talked about this in the characteristics. Homeostasis is the idea that we keep a balance. So you'll see here, within humans, our control center is what's considered our brain. And if we are too hot, we sense that change, and then our body sends a response to bring down a temperature. If we're too cold, again, your body sends a response telling you, hey, we got to do something to make sure we're not cold anymore. So we start shivering, and it means our muscles are generating heat to try and keep our body at a normal temperature. So we, as humans, have a very nice way of balancing. When your body is not maintaining homeostasis, that's a problem. And then finally, the fourth principle is what's known as evolution. I don't want you to be scared of the concept of evolution. Evolution can be defined as the change in characteristics of living things over time, meaning that all living things come from a shared ancestor, and that shared ancestor has had changes over time and over time and over time to eventually create various different organisms. But evolution happens every single day. Understand that humans from 100 years ago and humans today are not 100% identical. We have traits that have been kind of washed out because they're no longer needed. An example of a pretty relatively new genetic change or evolutionary change is the idea of wisdom teeth. People don't need them anymore, so you're going to see more and more people born without wisdom teeth because of the fact that we don't need them for an evolutionary standpoint to survive. So please understand that. Evolution occurs due to natural selection. So if you need a trait, it's typically favored in nature, and so that trait will typically pass on. But again, this happens through generations. So generational change is harder to visualize because it happens within lots and lots of years. So humans have a hard time seeing those changes because they happen within spans of 100, 200, 300 years, and no one really lives for 200 years. So again, those are the principles of biology. And then the final slide talking about biodiversity. We are going to add quite a bit to our notes about biodiversity. What I want you to know now is that I just talked about evolution and these changes that occur. The life on Earth, this current life on Earth is very diverse. And the reason for that is because of evolution. It is the result of changes over time that have allowed new organisms to develop in the changing atmosphere and the changing world that we have. Also understand biodiversity includes every living organism, not just what you see, but anything that's microscopic as well. If it's living, it is part of our biodiversity and is important for our world to survive. All right, this is the last slide. If you'll notice, I have been putting videos after every single slide just for you to see how you're doing with understanding the concepts. What I want you to do is, if you have any questions, concerns, if you have a joke or anything like that, leave it on the last question and I will get to it. This is a great opportunity for you to ask questions if you're not comfortable asking them in class. Please know that I do look at those. I don't ignore them. Maybe I won't get to it the first day, but I do look at those. I hope this video has been easy to follow. Maybe my voice isn't the greatest, but you'll probably get used to it. If you have any questions, again, please make sure to ask me on Edpuzzle or ask me in class. Thanks.